Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. Thanks for joining us, and remember to subscribe for free on your favorite platform. My guest today is Nancy Lawson, author of The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife, and Wildscape, Trilling Chipmunks, Beckoning Blooms, Salty Butterflies, and Other Sensory Wonders of Nature. Nancy is a nature writer, habitat consultant, and founder of The Humane Gardener, who pioneers creative, wildlife-friendly landscaping methods. She co-chairs Howard County Bee City of Maryland and co-launched a community science project, Monarch RX, after discovering a little-known butterfly behavior in her own garden. Her books and other work have been featured in Science Magazine, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Oprah Magazine, Entomology Today, Ecological Entomology, and American Gardener. Her book Wildscape received an honorable mention in the American Horticulture Society's National Book Award and was a finalist for the AAAS Subaru Prize for Excellence in Science Books. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted you're here, particularly because your work paints a vivid picture of how deeply our environment is woven into the fabric of our well-being, not just environmentally, but emotionally and socially too. You've spoken about this in a number of places, and one quote that really stood out to me comes from American Gardener magazine, where you said, and I'm quoting here, "At the core of my work is a philosophy that plants are the solution to many societal problems." We're all familiar with the role our green friends play in mitigating everything from climate change to depression. But if we let plants lead the way, they could also repair our distorted relationships with wildlife, even in our own backyards. That's a striking idea. And I'm wondering, what does it look like to let plants lead? And how can that shift the way we relate to the natural world around us?
I like to kind of observe a lot how plants grow and how they fill in a space and where they like to grow on their own rather than exerting so much control over the landscape. I think when people first move into a new home or when they're managing a public space too, oftentimes will overlay their own idea of what it should be onto the landscape without actually taking a step back and seeing what's already growing, understanding that there might be some really valuable treasures there for wildlife and for us. So for me, it means just planting for wildlife and creating habitat, which is so needed in this day and age, wherever we can do it. But also actually working with nature to see what plants are already in the seed bank, what's volunteering from the soil, what the birds and the wind are bringing in. The more habitat you create, the more you get. Once you start doing that, you also start seeing more and more birds, more and more butterflies and other animals and animals you may never even have heard of before.
I like the way you describe that, because in looking at your body of work, it's clear to me that your work is grounded in the idea that humans are but one part of the greater whole. And I want to read another quote from your book Wildscape, where you wrote, "If you treat the local environment like the homeland it's meant to be, you'll be exposed to more cultures and ideas and ways of life than if you visited with people from every country in the world. You'll see that your yard and your community green spaces are not really yours at all, but the gathering place of countless sovereign nations, a refuge for the increasingly displaced." What do you mean by cultures and borders in that context?
We humans are just one species. We have the same needs and things that we can't live without. At the same time, though, we can go all around the globe biologically. If we have the means, we can live almost anywhere. That's because we're such generalists, but a lot of plants and animals are not. They have much more specialized needs and habitats. Depending on where you live, you might be among a vastly different range of species. Oftentimes we'll travel to go see some cool wildlife somewhere else when actually there's a whole bunch of undiscovered things right here in our own backyards. By cultures, I mean the lifestyles, the life histories of an ant versus a chipmunk versus the cardinal that was just nesting outside my office in the coral honeysuckle vine over the last few weeks. They all just want to survive and reproduce and live their lives, but they have completely different ways of doing that. Once you start observing them, it's really easy now to go and actually look up, what does this animal need? Where do they live? Where do they mate? An ambassador animal for me for habitat is the chipmunk. Their whole lives center around trees, and they need hollow logs oftentimes is where they're going to mate, where they run and take shelter from predators. They, of course, eat nuts, and they line their nests underground, their burrows, with leaves to stay warm in the winter and insulate the burrow. And so there's all these different ways that they're relying upon trees, and they're also planting trees when they're burying nuts. And they're spreading mycorrhizal fungi that helps trees grow because they bring water and nutrients to the roots. And there's that mutualistic relationship between trees and fungi. And so there's this whole culture around a tree that a chipmunk has. They make their burrows in hollowed out roots of trees that have died. It's just fascinating.
So, how many chipmunks have you seen in your garden over the years?
Maybe a dozen or so. During the pandemic, I saw one almost every morning who liked to hang out in the retaining wall and stand up there and eat nuts and snails. And I've seen them by the pond. They like to go under the rocks.
Among our listeners are probably many passionate gardeners and nature lovers, but I'm assuming that not all of them may understand why planting native species is so important and why we should avoid non-native species. Can you explain that for us?
So many species are actually tied to native plants that they evolved with. A lot of people who are doing wildlife gardening know the vast majority of butterflies and moths rely on host plants because they've evolved to be able to digest them. Everything from a goldenrod or an aster supports a whole number of different moth and butterfly species, but also oak trees are really the ones that support the most of all. Black cherries, all kinds of native plants. In turn, birds feed most of those caterpillars to their young. And there's also birds who rely on a lot of the fruits of native plants because they have the protein and the fats that they need on their migrations. And the structure of some of these trees and the bark and all of these things where bats can roost, these animals have evolved to use in different ways. When you're planting non-native plants, some of them can support some of this wildlife somewhat, but they don't have nearly the intricate relationship with a lot of the species that native species do. And also, some of them have become so prolific and they don't have the natural checks and balances. They don't have the same insects that are eating them all the time and keeping them in check. Oftentimes, a lot of our native mammals do not like those non-native plants as much. And so they tend to take over our forests and our woods and our meadows. It's then difficult to create habitat that's as enticing to local wildlife who've come to depend upon it.
Let's say someone is starting from scratch. They want to have a native garden, but their yard is full of invasive plants. Should they remove the invasives and replant with nursery grown natives, or try to rely on seed banks that are already in the soil?
Well, I think a combination of both is helpful. I mean, I had that situation here. The previous owners had planted Bradford pears and miscanthus and burning bush and barberry and these things that aren't native and that do take over wildlife habitat. But there were things that were not invasive in that way, but that were actually sheltering birds and sheltering squirrels and other wildlife. And so we left those types of shrubs because that was the only thing besides flat lawn in the landscape. We set about taking out the barberry, taking out the miscanthus, and replacing those. And with the lawn, I think lawn is one of the most problematic things of all. We had old lawn, so it was very tenaciously rooted, all kinds of different non-native grasses, and pretty easy with that to just either dig it out or cover it, which is what I have done in my later years. But I also love to see about half of our habitat, at least, if I had to quantify it, it would be at least that, is just native trees and perennials and shrubs and even native annuals from the seed bank. it's really good to keep your eye out for those things that often they'll come up in the protection of other plants. Like I just found a little oak tree. It was surrounded by volunteer Geum canadense, white avens, which is a little wildflower, native wildflower, and some sea oats grasses. And because it's protected, it hadn't been browsed yet. So I just moved the whole clump out of the path to a sunnier area where it will do better. Getting to know those plants is a lot easier too now than it was when I first started, because we have iNaturalist and you can really quickly just go and get some identifications. Just upload your picture instead of starting from scratch.
How can people find out what are truly native plants for their own region? What are some trusted sources or tools that you would recommend?
So the first thing I would do is look and see if your state has a native plant society. I think almost all of them do. Many, if not most, have good websites with native planting ideas and species profiles and such. Also, there's good groups on social media, either by state or region.
Oh, great.
There's also databases. The National Wildlife Federation and Audubon have native plant databases where you can put in your zip code. And Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center is one that I really love too.
In your article, The Case for Prolific Plants, that appeared in the recent March-April 2025 issue of the American Gardener, you call native spreaders free spirits of the plant world. I love that. And you describe them as the real workhorses of the nascent wildlife garden. Why is it important to embrace these more assertive native plants?
First of all, wildlife, they're attracted oftentimes to massing. There are visual and olfactory cues that they can actually respond to when there are more plants congregating, as opposed to having just one plant of a species here and one there. Also, they help to actually crowd out or keep out some of those species that aren't as helpful to wildlife, those introduced species. You can be really successful with starting a garden, a wildlife garden, quickly that way. Once it's established and you've got a bunch of it, you'll notice that mammal nibbling, if it's there, it's not going to be as difficult for you because you've got so much of a plant and it's well established. When they're small and tender, I think you want to start with those things that in your area are chemically or structurally a little less tasty.
We are going to talk about the nibblers in a couple of minutes here. You have shown beautiful pictures of your own garden on your website. Creating a natural habitat isn't just for people with a couple of acres. What are some design principles for folks that live in urban environments or much smaller suburban spaces?
There's some really good design principles that were introduced a couple decades ago by a landscape architect named Joan Nussauer in Michigan. She talks about the fact that you need to create these frameworks of familiarity, basically, where people understand that this is an intentional garden. First of all, having a mowed strip in the front, even just like a walkable strip next to the sidewalk or something like that, or having plants they recognize even if they're not native. My favorite ones are more to actually have things that are also helping wildlife as much as possible at the same time. So you can have little native sedges that kind of look like lawn along the front that are low growing. Definitely put bird baths, which you should do anyway, because we need a lot more water sources. And that shows that there's a human here doing something. Sometimes paths through your garden show that it's an inviting place. I like the lining path with logs and branches and stuff. When my neighbors cut down their trees, having a tree trunk piece. So you could put a pot on it, you could put a bird bath on it, and then it's a natural habitat element in two ways.
You mentioned lawns earlier, and lawns are everywhere. Pretty much lawns are synonymous, like the car, with the United States. I see that there is an increasingly growing interest in natural lawns.
Lawns are generally just so problematic that I'd like to have them reduced as much as possible. But I understand needing lawns for playing fields, a little bit of lawn for dogs or kids. I mean, we've got so many acres all over the country of unused lawn everywhere. Corporate spaces, yards. It's a tragedy. A more natural lawn would be one that you really aren't spraying, you aren't using pesticides on, granule fertilizer, all of that stuff, because that's detrimental. There's still insects that can live in lawns that aren't maintained that way. For example, native bees can live in sort of old patchy lawn because they tend to like some of that compacted soil where the lawn is sparse and there's spaces in the ground, like along the edges of where you walk. Clover is fine. It's not as good for pollinators as native wildflowers that are sometimes used in native lawn mixes because so many of those native bees have evolved to specialize on the local plants. But clover also, I don't want anyone to spray it. It just comes in if you manage your lawn more naturally. And the rabbits, the groundhogs, I've seen the deer eat it. They just nibble, 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 nibble. And so I think if you're trying to take the pressure off some of your plants that you've planted or the areas that you're trying to grow, leave some of those other things that come in because the mammals are loving those. I've heard people say to me after I've mentioned this, oh, I started to do that. I left the clover and now that's where I see the bunnies all the time. They're only in the lawn eating the clovers.
Well, along with lawns comes so often mulch. What are some eco-friendly alternatives to conventional mulch?
Mulching, people do it to suppress weeds, right? But first of all, a lot of these things they're suppressing are not weeds. It keeps native plants from spreading. It also eliminates the possibility that ground nesting bees can nest between your plants, which they will often do if you just have plants. And most of our native bees, up to 80%, probably are ground nesters. They're solitary. They're so tiny, people don't realize they're there. They don't sting. Some of them can sting, but it would be a very rare event for them to do that because they're solitary, they don't have hives to defend. So if you're actually putting mulch, I've seen places where they put them over the nest when it's already in progress, not realizing. And you're also preventing bees from making a nest there. Also, mulch will end up just inviting more weeds as it breaks down. If you don't have enough native plants yet, you're just continuously, perpetually creating this problem. Instead, planting these native ground covers and these sort of matrix design where you have low ground covers growing among the taller plants, the taller perennials, and ground covers around trees and shrubs. That's a really good way, especially some of those prolific ground covers like robin's planting in our area, golden ragwort, things like that, columbines, these things, phloxes that spread. It's a really good way to start to keep out the quote unquote weeds that you're trying to suppress. Also, arborist wood chips. Wood chips are great. They're there anyway. The arborists need somewhere to dump them. You can sign up on Chip Drop or some of these other places to get them delivered.
So we talked about lawns, we talked about mulch, and of course, now we're going to move on to leaves. Leaves in the fall. I have to say, fall is my favorite season of the year. For me, more leaves, the better. But not everybody feels that way. Should we be getting rid of leaves, shredding them, letting them lie? What should we do with all these leaves?
So oak trees, they tend to have leaves that don't break down nearly as quickly as other trees. But since they also attract the most caterpillars, you've got caterpillars among those leaves. You've got them pupating, you've got cocoons in there, chrysalises, and also a lot of insects, other insects living in the leaf itself. There are things that you can do to preserve them by moving them under other shrubs, other trees. If there's too many on your lawn, for example, and you want to retain some lawn, if you can, the best thing to do is to leave leaves because it creates this natural moist environment, not only for those insects, but also for fireflies, birds forage in there. And a new study from the University of Maryland found that when you take leaves away or shred them, it reduces butterfly and moth caterpillar emergence by about half.
Oh my goodness, half.
Yeah, and it had pretty negative effects on spiders and beetles as well. I mean, these are all important insects. Beetles are pollinators and decomposers and predators and prey. It's sort of a spectrum of what's the best you can do. If you're drowning in leaves because you have a small yard, you might have to give the leaves away or send them to the leaf composting facility or shred them, just being aware of what's going to happen with that to the butterflies and moths. But the best thing is just to leave them.
How do we figure out when they can take some of those leaves? Are there better times, worse times for doing that?
That's a really tough one because all year long there's insects in those leaves. If they're simply moving them, they're not going to hurt nearly as much. The thing you have to be aware of, though, bumblebees overwinter under the leaves. After the bumblebees start coming out, and it depends what area you're in, but you'll start to see them here. It's April, May. It depends on the bumblebee species, but they can withstand some colder temperatures than some of the other bees, and so you'll see them a bit earlier.
I like your point about really being aware of the wildlife that is living in these leaves and needs these leaves either for their homes or protection. And the fact that we should be very intentional about deciding to move a group of leaves if that's what we feel that we need to do, which brings me to my next question. A lot of folks live in areas that have HOAs, and you advocate for gardens that embrace low impact native habitat landscaping, but not all homeowners associations are on board with that. How can someone navigate difficult HOA rules?
A lot of times, first of all, people don't actually know what the rules are when they get cited for a wildlife garden or a native plant garden. Looking in your architectural guidelines to see, is this actually something that's prohibited? In so many cases, it's not, or the rules are very vague. So understanding that first is key. Same thing with weed ordinances too in municipalities, because oftentimes these things start because a neighbor gets upset and calls the HOA or calls the weed authority. And so they'll come out and just assume that everything's a weed when it's not. And then if it does say you can't have weeds, prepare for a conversation about what weeds actually are and what native plants actually are, and invite people over so that you can explain it to them and why you have this garden. HOA rules, they're a little trickier, I think, than a municipality because it's not a democracy. It's not involving elected officials as well as municipal staff and people who are accountable to the public. They can be reasonable or they can be unreasonable. And so you have to first see what you're working with. And in my sister's case, she got cited for her garden. We found out very quickly when we tried all the things like education, posting a sign, writing letters, making them aware of the intention. These were not people who wanted to have any kind of a dialogue at all. In some cases, though, that's not the case. People just don't know. And there's more and more states that are enacting laws or considering enacting laws to allow these types of gardens and override the HOA rules. Here in Maryland, where I live, we can actually cite the law that my sister's case inspired, which requires HOAs to allow wildlife gardens, rain gardens, conservation landscaping. Just doing a little bit of research first and then finding out where there might be some chance for discussion.
I think that's really, really good advice. In your work, you beautifully celebrate even the smallest creatures. I saw recently where you describe a young American toad you found perched on a hemlock varnish shelf, a type of flat mushroom. And alongside the pictures you shared on social media, you wrote, "When my childhood storybooks come to life, it reminds me of what the world once was, what it still is in some places, and what it could be everywhere." That is so beautiful. Where did your love of nature come from? Was that something your family instilled in you when you were a child, or is that something you embraced all on your own later on?
It's a combination of both. So my dad was a plant pathologist and he loved flowers. That was his specialty. So we always had gardens. We always had flowers. We were always outside. My mom loved animals. And my parents took us camping a lot. We would go across the country to Oregon to visit my grandparents and we would camp along the way. And That exposure to nature, I think, is something I hear from so many people who end up doing this for a living in some way or another, is that they were outside as a kid. So it was always in me. And then I had my normal trajectory through teenagehood and early adulthood where I was thinking about other things. And then I started a garden on the patio when I first got married, and I just was so entranced by it, and things just gradually snowballed from there. I started working at the Humane Society of the US, it was called at the time. I was really excited about the Urban Wildlife Department because they had a big emphasis on learning to coexist. The tragedy of grass, I remember talking with them about a lot. I think all those things kind of came together. You need to nurture both or help both. Plants and animals rely on each other, which always sounds so basic when I say it. I was also signed up for the Master Gardener program back then just to get to know different experts in the area and know the resources out there. And so I was in this world where people were like, trap everything and poison everything to protect your plants. That's changed too. A lot of Master Gardener extension programs are more welcoming. And then on the other hand, in this world of people who were really focused on helping backyard wildlife, but didn't necessarily plant for them.
Right. I know what you're talking about. The work for a very, very long time has been enormously siloed.
Right.
And that's what I find interesting about what you do. You really connect the two and you explain why the two are inextricably intertwined. You mentioned butterflies earlier, and there was a recent Science magazine article that found that 22% of butterflies in the US have disappeared between 2000 and 2020. So in 20 years, that's such a tragic decline. And the decline suggests multiple threats: habitat loss, climate change, and pesticide use. What can people do at home to help pollinators like butterflies, even if they don't have a lot of space?
A lot of the things that we've been talking about, leave the leaves where you can. Think of the monarch butterfly. Those butterflies are migrating. In most places in the country, they're not staying in your backyard unless you're like in the deep southeast. They're going to Mexico or the coast of California. Whereas all these other species, most of them, some others migrate, but most of them are overwintering in a chrysalis on a plant stalk or under the leaves. And so you need to be mindful of the fact that not only do we need flowers and host plants, but we also need that overwintering habitat. So we need that decay. We need to leave the decaying plant material. And also definitely not pesticides, because that's really thought to be the number one problem leading to these declines. People will hire these lawn services and they will not actually press them on what they're applying. And they'll say, it's all safe, it's all safe. And people like to believe it. And it's just simply not true.
We're heading into the summer season here, and that often comes with the mosquitoes. And we know that these pesticide companies, or the ones that are promising to spray against mosquitoes, make all sorts of claims that their services are natural or pollinator safe. What are the dangers of these sprays that people may not realize?
First of all, mosquitoes can be pollinators. There's so many myths that are inherent to the mosquito company marketing, and the products that they're using are not specific. So most of them are using pyrethroids, and they'll say natural because pyrethrins are the natural version that are derived from chrysanthemums. But those are also very harmful to insects in general. Pyrethroids are the synthetic version, and often there'll be additives that make them last even longer, so have these residual effects for weeks. Those kill all insects, and they'll tell you we're only spraying where mosquitoes are. Well, that's a bunch of baloney, because insects are everywhere. So where the mosquitoes are, there are fireflies roosting. Fireflies aren't just alive at night when we see them sparkle. They're roosting in shady, cool areas in the plants during the day because they need moisture, they can't dry out. Sure, maybe if you're saying you're spraying in the morning or at night, maybe it's too cold yet for the bees to be out, or they're back in going to sleep. Well, they're under the flowers, they're in the ground, they're under the leaves. You can see the sleeping bees if you walk around at night. I recently talked to someone at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation about this, and he gave this great example of leafcutter bees are taking leaves. They like grapevines and redbuds and roses, and they make these little round leaf shapes, and they line their nests with them. Well, if that's a sprayed, treated plant, which if you're mosquito spraying it will be, they're bringing that back to their nest, potentially harming themselves and their larvae. There's just so many myths. Now I see essential oil spraying being marketed. I saw an ad on Instagram from one of the big companies showing a guy with a leaf blower just spraying all over the plants. And this is also very toxic to insects in general. I mean, it's supposed to be a repellent, but depending on the type of oil you're using, they can be very harmful. And some of these things, they'll cause sublethal effects. You might not see direct mortality, but you could be harming them so that they have shorter lives or their reproduction is damaged. Other things that happen with these products.
Mm-hmm.
You need to instead eliminate standing water. If you have pots or trays lying around, mosquitoes can breed even in a teaspoon of water. It takes a number of days, though. It's like between egg laying and hatching. I mean, it's maybe 8 days. If you are dumping standing water, that's the number one thing. So the other thing besides standing water is there are ways to be comfortable outside when mosquitoes are out. If you're out there having dinner or something, you can use a small fan. That will prevent them from coming near you because mosquitoes can't fly in the wind, even a small amount of wind.
Fascinating.
And you can use repellents, personal repellents. You can choose to stay inside when they're out the most, like an hour before dusk, an hour after. There's a number of things that you can do that don't involve something so toxic.
We mentioned bees earlier, and in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of talk about the importance of bees as pollinators.
Wild native bees, there's about 4,000 in the US, different species. Most of them are solitary. Bumblebees are the most social ones. And the solitary moms make nests either in the ground or in dead wood or plant stalks. And so they're cavity nesting bees. And there's a lot fewer species of those. They need habitat. Whereas honeybees, they have their own hive. They're introduced species from Europe. They have a man-made place to live. Essentially, they're a domesticated animal. And they have been important to agriculture for the last few hundred years, but we're finding more and more that native bees are just as important and often even better pollinators of our food crops. But it's just that people weren't studying them. What's happening now is that people are thinking that to save the bees, they need to get a hive. And that means that they're introducing thousands of bees that are not from this landscape into their gardens, into their farms. And the native bees who are already there are actually suffering because of that. So not only is there potential for disease transmission from the honeybees, which is a big problem, but there's also a competition for floral resources. And so a lot of studies are showing that native bees are being outcompeted in these urban and suburban areas when people are introducing hives. And like where I live on my street, it's a sort of semi-rural street, and there are a number of people who've gotten hives. I've seen the honeybees actually kind of pushing some of the native bees off the sumacs and the mountain mints. Not enough people, when they get a hive, are planting flowers. It's one of these things that if you want to save the bees, you have to be a wild beekeeper, meaning that you just need to nurture habitat, nurture the bees that are already there, plant flowers for them, be aware of the fact that they're nesting in the ground and under the leaves and in your plant stalks and dead wood and things like that.
In the greater DC area, deer are becoming a regular sight in many neighborhoods. I know on the trail on which I run, I often see deer, and actually I enjoy that. And I try to let them know that I'm just part of the ecosystem, same as they are, and will leave them alone and just continue on my path. But I know that deer are also spreading out into other areas in the country as well. And people often complain about deers, rabbits, and other animals eating their plants. And they also complain about animals like mice mice, voles, chipmunks, and squirrels. But you take a very different approach. So I'm wondering, how can we coexist with local wildlife, and how can others rethink how they regard these species, especially if they're a gardener?
You should actually plan for nibblings. You can plant plants or let plants grow that deer and rabbits and groundhogs actually like. For example, there are plants like common evening primrose that people will often take out. They think it's rangy. It's like this gorgeous plant that hummingbirds love. It supports moth caterpillars and moths at nighttime because it'll bloom in the evening. And it's also very tasty to deer and rabbits, sort of like a salad plant for them. And then intermingling plants that they don't like. And so if you're trying to protect something, you can use minty plants or plants with other chemicals that they find unpalatable, like late boneset or blue mistflower and milkweeds. And you can mix these in with the more tender ones, grasses. They don't tend to go to native grasses and ferns. Oftentimes people will plunk down 5 plants, 5 coneflowers, 10 inches apart, and then that's just easy pickings. A lot of times too, I'll just protect something with a cage, a shrub or a tree, and until it gets established. There's combinations of strategies like that you can use. And I think it starts with observing how these animals move through the landscape.
Some people think that the humane thing to do when there's a wildlife conflict is to trap and relocate the animal. And you've said that this is not only ineffective, but it's also potentially harmful.
First of all, if you're trapping and removing an animal, then you're not considering the source of why they were there in the first place. So it's not effective because nature pours a vacuum and more of the same species are just going to come in and use that same space again. Also, it's not humane because trapping usually involves sort of indiscriminate, oh, I think I have a vole problem or I think I have a groundhog problem. I'm going to trap him and move him. Well, what if it's a mom who's raising young and then you've separated the family, the young are going to die? Where are you moving the mom to? For rabbits, the stress can be so bad. They're prey animals, they just die. Mammals are smart, so they have cognitive maps. They know where their food sources are in their territory. They know the predators. Once they reach their destination, they don't have any of that. It's like if we were to be plunked down somewhere in another country without a wallet or a map or knowing anybody. It's been shown that some of these animals have much greater mortality much more quickly when you do that. So people think it's humane because they're not killing them directly, but they're sort of death by a few cuts. One thing people think about when they first see an animal too is it's eating something, it's a problem, I've got to get rid of it. We as humans don't have a lot of patience. The number one recommendation is to sit back and watch. A lot of times animals are just moving through and they're not going to be there forever. They might be nesting temporarily. They might even just be coming through the neighborhood.
I agree. Having that respect for our fellow living beings is what you're really talking about. It's a completely different mindset than a lot of folks have. You've also written about road ecology and the unseen dangers that cars and roads pose to wildlife. As I drive down the road, I try to be very aware of certain times of day, or if I know there are woods nearby, to be careful that I am not going to inadvertently come across somebody trying to cross the road. What kind of solutions do you think are most promising with regard to this?
I love the book Crossings by Ben Goldfarb, and I had written about this years ago at the Humane Society. I think some of the solutions back then are still some of the best ones now. Overpasses, underpasses, make underpasses in culverts for turtles by directing the animals, fencing off a bit of the road. Those all take money, they take time, they take convincing the governments, but you can also slow down, especially during certain times of the season when there are turtles crossing the road to mate, salamanders, frogs. I've been with my friends sometimes where we take a piece of cardboard and nudge the frogs.
I stop. I stop the car if I can. I stop the car, get out, put on the hazards, and then take them to the next place that they're going.
There's so many other animals getting hit all the time. There's a highway in Texas that scientists called a slaughterhouse for monarch butterflies. There's so many other animals getting hit, but we're not as affected by it. Our cars aren't ruined and people don't die. The estimates have been something like 1 million a day of vertebrates. Then there's countless invertebrates on top of that are hit by cars.
Oh dear. It's really heartbreaking to me when I hear something like that. It makes me feel really sick. You mentioned migration with the monarch butterflies, and one of the things that we can do is to remind people to turn off outdoor lights during migration season. Can you explain why light pollution is such a serious issue for birds and other wildlife and what actions people can take to help?
Moths and birds, they get confused by light. If they're migrating, they're using different cues. And if they're following the moonlight, then they're attracted to these lights in the city and the street lights and our lamp lights and our home landscapes. Moths will be flying around them for hours at a time when they should be mating, and they're wasting all their energy. And birds will do this around skyscrapers and such. They just get exhausted. Sometimes they'll crash into the windows. So the windows are a problem, not just because of light, because of the transparency and the reflection. Fireflies need total darkness to be able to see when they're mating. That's how they communicate when they're sparkling, lighting up. They won't be doing that in an area with security lights blaring. And so it has so many impacts. It has ripple effects too, because some animals will avoid lit areas. Plants that are moth pollinated have been found to have lower seed set in the presence of too much light. Light affects plant growth. It can make plants become stunted. Plants need to rest in the dark.
So the choices we make on a daily basis really have a huge cascading impact on everything around us. This brings me to basically our last question. Your work inspires people to make better choices in their gardens. Can you offer some other ways people can live more harmoniously with the planet?
Well, first, people can just be more kind to each other.
Yes, more of that, definitely.
You can't help animals if you don't help people. Also, just in terms of the personal choices that we make, if we want to help wildlife and animals in general and the planet, one is intensive agriculture. The pollution of factory farms on so much land, air and water pollution is incredibly vast. And also, reducing meat consumption will help. The rangelands out west are just populated by so many cows that are eating up the plants that wildlife could be using. It's a huge ripple effect of issues that occur from our massive amount of meat consumption. Just bringing it to a more reasonable level would be helpful. Just raising awareness, I think, becoming more involved in our communities and not just in our own gardens, and helping people, helping children to understand these relationships among plants and animals and how it affects all of us.
So, where can people find you online?
I am at humanegardener.com, and I have Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky pages by the same name.
Nancy, thank you so much for having taken the time today.
Thank you.